Breaking news out of Russia, where prison officials there say the country's prominent opposition leader, Alexey Navalny, has died in prison. The outspoken Kremlin critic has been in a Russian jail since 2021. In August last year, he was found guilty on extremist charges and sentenced to an additional 19 years in prison. Navalny denied the charges. Moments ago, Vice President Kamala Harris gave her reaction to the news.
We've all just received reports that Alexey Navalny has died in Russia. This is, of course, terrible news, which we are working to confirm. My prayers are with his family, including his wife, Yulia, who is with us today. And if confirmed, this would be a further sign of Putin's brutality. Whatever story they tell, let us be clear, Russia is responsible. And we will have more to say on this later.
Earlier today, Secretary of State Antony Blinken commented on the loss.
We've heard the reports from Russia of Alexey Navalny's death in prison. For more than a decade, the Russian government, Putin, have persecuted, poisoned, and imprisoned Alexey Navalny. And now, the reports of his death. First and foremost, if these reports are accurate, our hearts go out to his wife and to his family. Beyond that, his death in a Russian prison and the fixation and fear of one man only underscores the weakness and rot at the heart of the system that Putin has built. Russia's responsible for this. We'll be talking to many other countries concerned about Alexey Navalny, especially if these reports bear out to be true.
Earlier today, we heard from Yulia, Navalny's wife. He was at that conference. She was at that conference in Munich. What did she say?
Well, she said, first of all, she doesn't know whether she can believe the statements that are coming from Russia, the official statements. She said that, for years, Putin and his government have lied. But she said if it's true, she wants Putin and his entourage to know, and I quote, that they will be held accountable for everything they did to my country and to my family. She's also said that she wants to call on the entire world community, essentially, to unite together and work against Putin's regime in Russia because of both what's happened to her husband and the war in Ukraine as well. It was a very brief statement. She opened the speech saying that she didn't know whether she needs to stay here or fly immediately to see her children, but then she decided to stay and give this speech because she thought that her husband would have done that and would have wanted her to do that as well.
What can you tell us about the conditions Navalny faced in prison?
So he was sent into Russia's basically Arctic region. It's very far north. It's very cold. It's very remote. It's one of those sort of high security prisons in Russia, kind of almost reminiscent of the old Gulag system. You can't really call them. It's very hard to reach by mail. The lawyers are still trying to get to this prison and figure out what actually happened there. Very harsh conditions. It's very cold. Navalny, as we know, was sent to solitary confinement multiple times, and that's very, very harsh conditions. You sit alone in a small, cold box. And his team has always said that they are very concerned about his health with regards to how he was treated in that prison.
Mary, thanks so much.
Alexey Navalny, he bravely stood up to the corruption, the violence, and all the bad things that the Putin government was doing. In response, Putin had him poisoned, he had him arrested, he had him prosecuted for fabricated crimes, he sentenced him to prison, he was held in isolation. Even all that didn't stop him from calling out Putin's lies. Even in prison, he was a powerful voice for the truth, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. And he could have lived safely in exile after the assassination attempt on him in 2020, which nearly killed him, I might add. But he was traveling outside the country at the time. Instead, he returned to Russia. Knowing he'd likely be imprisoned or even killed if he continued his work. But he did it anyway, because he believed so deeply in his country, in Russia. Reports of his death, if they're true, and I have no reason to believe they're not, Russian authorities are going to tell their own story. But make no mistake, Putin is responsible for Navalny's death. Putin is responsible. What has happened to Navalny is yet more proof of Putin's brutality. No one should be fooled, not in Russia, not at home, not anywhere in the world. Putin does not only target his citizens of other countries, as we've seen what's going on in Ukraine right now, he also inflicts terrible crimes on his own people. And as people across Russia and around the world are mourning Navalny today because he was so many things that Putin was not. He was brave, he was principled, he was dedicated to building a Russia where the rule of law existed and where it applied to everybody. Navalny believed in that Russia. He knew it was a cause worth fighting for, and obviously even dying for. This tragedy reminds us of the stakes of this moment. We have to provide the funding so Ukraine can keep defending itself against Putin's vicious onslaughts and war crimes. You know, there was a bipartisan Senate vote that passed overwhelmingly in the United States Senate to fund Ukraine. Now, as I've said before, and I mean this in a literal sense, history is watching. History is watching the House of Representatives. The failure to support Ukraine at this critical moment will never be forgotten. It's going to go down in the pages of history. It really is. It's consequential. And the clock is ticking. And this has to happen. We have to help now. You know, we have to realize what we're dealing with Putin. All of us should reject the dangerous statements made by the previous president that invited Russia to invade our NATO allies if they weren't paying up. He said if an ally did not pay their dues, he'd encourage Russia to, quote, do whatever the hell they want. I guess I should clear my mind here a little bit and not say what I'm really thinking, but let me be clear. This is an outrageous thing for a president to say. I can't fathom. From Truman on, they're rolling over in their graves hearing this. As long as I'm president, America stands by our sacred commitment to our NATO allies, as they have stood by their commitments to us repeatedly. Putin and the whole world should know, if any adversary were to attack us, our NATO allies would back us. And if Putin were to attack a NATO ally, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory. Now's the time for even greater unity among our NATO allies, to stand up to the threat that Putin's Russia poses. You know, I send my deepest condolences to Alexey's staff and supporters. We're going to continue his work despite this loss, despite all of Putin's desperate attempts to stamp out the opposition, and most of all to his family, especially to his wife, his daughter, and his son, who have already sacrificed so much for their family and a shared dream for a better future for Russia. So I just want to say God bless Alexey Navalny. His courage will not be forgotten, and I'm sure it will not be the only courage we see coming out of Russia in the near term. Thank you. I'll be happy to take a couple questions.
Sir, first, was this an assassination?
The answer is that we don't know exactly what happened, but there is no doubt that the death of Navalny was the consequence of something that Putin and his thugs did.
And to be clear, you warned Vladimir Putin when you were in Geneva of devastating consequences if Navalny died in Russian custody. What consequences should he and Russia face?
That was 3 years ago. In the meantime, they faced a hell of a lot of consequences. They've lost and/or had wounded over 350,000 Russian soldiers. They've made in a position where they've been subjected to great sanctions across the board, and we're contemplating what else could be done. But what we were talking about at the time, there were no actions being taken against Russia. And look, all that's transpired since then.
Can you say whether you're looking at increasing sanctions on Russia right now?
We're looking at a whole number of options. That's all I'll say right now.
Is there anything you can do to get ammunition to the Ukrainians without a supplemental from Congress?
No, but it's about time they step up, don't you think? Instead of going on a 2-week vacation. 2 weeks. They're walking away. 2 weeks. What are they thinking? My God, this is bizarre. And it's just reinforcing all the concern and almost, I won't say panic, but real concern about the United States being a reliable ally. This is outrageous.
Are you more confident now that you'll get the Ukraine aid, given what's happened today?
Well, I hope to God it helps. But I mean, the idea we need anything more to get the Ukraine aid. I mean, this is in light of a former president's statement that saying Russia, if they haven't paid their dues to us, go get them. Come on, what are these guys doing? What are they doing?
Sir, how concerned are you about the anti-satellite capability that Russia is developing, and what is your administration planning to do in response?
First of all, there is no nuclear threat to the people of America or anywhere else in the world with what Russia is doing at the moment, number one. Number two, anything that they're doing or they will do relates to satellites and space and damaging those satellites potentially. Number three, there is no evidence that they have made a decision to go forward with doing anything in space either. So what we found out, there was a capacity to launch a system into space that could theoretically do something that was damaging. Hadn't happened yet, and my hope is it will not.
Thank you all. I'll
take one more.
Thank you, Mr. President. Switching gears for a moment, have the Israelis presented a credible evacuation plan for the nearly 1.5 million displaced Palestinians sheltering in Rafah? And what would the consequences be for Israel if they move ahead with a full-scale ground invasion without clear measures to protect civilians there?
Well, first of all, I've had extensive conversations with the Prime Minister of Israel over the last several days, almost an hour each. And I've made the case, and I feel very strongly about it, that there has to be a temporary ceasefire to get the prisoners out, to get the hostages out. And that is underway. I'm still hopeful that that can be done. And in the meantime, I don't anticipate, I'm hoping that the Israelis will not make any massive land invasion in the meantime. So it's my expectation that's not going to happen. There has to be a ceasefire temporarily to get those hostages. And by the way, we're in a situation where there are American hostages. American citizens are being held hostage. It's not just Israelis, it's American hostages as well. And, my hope and expectation is that we'll get this hostage deal, we'll bring the Americans home, and the deal is being negotiated now, and we're going to see where it takes us.
An FBI informant at the center of the impeachment inquiry into you has been indicted for allegedly lying. Your reaction to that, and should the inquiry be dropped?
He is lying, and it should be dropped, and it's just been an outrageous effort from the beginning.
And we did.
See you in Ohio.
We head back to our top story today. Russia officials say the country's most prominent Putin critic, Alexey Navalny, has died in prison. A spokesperson for Navalny says they are still trying to confirm his death. The 47-year-old was serving a sentence for extremism in one of Russia's harshest penal colonies. A Kremlin spokesperson says that President Putin is up to date on Navalny's death, and Russia's investigative committee has launched a probe. Russia, meanwhile, is gearing up for a presidential election in which Putin is all but certain to win. President Biden spoke about the news from the White House just moments ago.
People across Russia and around the world are mourning Navalny today because he was so many things that Putin was not. He was brave, he was principled, he was dedicated to building a Russia where the rule of law existed and where it applied to everybody.
CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman is with us now. Willie, we heard President Biden say that his administration is actually looking at other possible consequences for Russia in response to Navalny's death. What are you learning?
Hey there, Lana. That's right. Those consequences could involve sanctions. That's what the president was asked earlier today in terms of how the U.S. will respond to this death of Alexey Navalny. And the president also mentioned, well, it's not been confirmed exactly by the U.S. government that he said he believes that it to be true. He said that he is not surprised, but he also mentioned that he is outraged by this death. We saw the vice president earlier today. She also expressed her condemnation of this event happening to Alexey Navalny, of course, an opposition leader there in Russia who has been in prison for quite some time. There was actually a moment where the vice president met with Navalny's wife, who was on the sidelines at the Munich Security Conference. She spoke right after the vice president spoke and gave remarks earlier today. And Vice President Harris, according to the Pool report, met briefly with Navalny's wife and essentially expressed her sympathies for his family in this terrible tragedy. But one of the things I wanted to point out in the president's statement, he essentially condemned Russia, but said this is yet again evidence of Russia's brutality and the brutality of Russian leader Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, he also reminded the nation that in 2020, Navalny was the subject of an assassination attempt. And nonetheless, he went back to Russia to continue to fight for the future of his homeland in a way that is contrary to the Putin administration. I want to talk a little bit about what we heard from the president in terms of standing by NATO allies. He called again for additional funding for Ukraine. He called on Congress to do their job. But he also made a contrast between himself and the former president, likely the person that he is going to run against in this upcoming presidential election, about NATO and standing with our NATO allies. Talk to our viewers about why that's so significant.
Yeah, well, this comes after comments by the former president essentially saying that Russia would be able to do whatever they wanted if NATO allies didn't pay up in terms of paying a percentage of their GDP in military spending, in NATO in military spending. And the former president has been blasted by not only President Biden, but others within the Democratic atmosphere. President Biden has used this as a campaign rallying cry. He's also been very critical of former President Trump, essentially calling those comments dumb. The president strongly said that in these remarks that he gave earlier today, that this is not the pathway that we want to go down, that we want to make sure that we defend NATO allies. He also called on the United States to further support Ukraine in its time of need, with that Ukraine funding making its way through the Senate, but also being stalled in the House. And the president essentially saying that history will not judge this kindly in terms of the United States not coming to the support of Ukraine in its time of need. And I think it's interesting to see this president speak so forcefully. He actually paused there, Lana. I'm pretty sure you saw it too.
Yeah.
Like he almost wanted to say something else. We know this president oftentimes shows emotion when it comes to personal moments, his family, but he also is starting to show a lot more emotion when it comes to his potential and likely opponent, former President Donald Trump.
Yeah, a long pause there as he said that former presidents were turning over in their graves. Willie James Inman at the White House. Thank you.
You bet.